While the church was growing stronger, the once mighty government of the Caesars was crumbling. Internal problems of the Roman Empire, such as corruption and disunity, made it easier for external forces to destroy it. Then came the final crushing blows, attacks by Germanic tribes. In the 4th century AD, most Germanic peoples in Europe lived east of the Rhine and north of the Danube rivers. To the west of the and the north of the Black Sea were Gothic peoples, that is, the East Goths, Ostrogoths, and the West Goths, Visigoths. To the west of these tribes, and extending over a large area east of the Rhine, were the Vandals, Lombards, Alemanni, Burgundians, and Franks. In the near present day Denmark lived the Jutes, Angles, and Saxons. These Germanic groups were semi nomads, that is, they both herded their cattle and farmed for a living. They were energetic and vigorous, and as a people prized strength and courage in battle. They worshipped many gods, including Tiw, the god of war, Wotan, the chief of the gods, Thor, the god of thunder, and Freya, the goddess of fertility. The names of these gods live on today in the English words Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The Germanic peoples governed themselves through tribal assemblies made up of voting freemen. Their laws were based on long established customs. These political practices, especially the use of assemblies, had a strong influence later in medieval England, where they had laid a foundation for parliamentary government and English common law. For hundreds of years, Romans and Germans had fought each other on the borders of the Roman Empire. Still, there were long periods of war and long periods of peace. During the peaceful periods, Roman and Germanic peoples mixed with one another. Some Germans entered the Roman Empire and settled on vacant lands. Others, captured in war, became slaves on the Roman estates. And still others became soldiers in the legions. If this process had been allowed to continue, the Germans might have been gradually absorbed into the empire completely. However, the German tribes, under attack by other tribes, and aware of the decay and weakness of the Roman Empire, took advantage of the opportunity. They turned the gradual mixing into an overwhelming invasion. The German tribes were forced into motion by a group of people called the Huns. During the 4th century, the Huns moved out of their territory in Central Asia into China, conquered it, then India, conquered it, and Europe. Mounted on swift horses, they attacked lightning fast and with ferocity. Crossing the Danube River, they conquered the Ostrogoths in Eastern Europe. The Visigoths, in the path of the Huns, fearing attack also, sought safety by attacking and occupying Roman settlements. So the Visigoths attacked Rome to get away from being attacked from the Huns. In 378 AD, the Roman Emperor Valens led a large army against the Visigoths at Adrianople, in present-day Bulgaria. Surprisingly, the Visigoths won the Battle of Adrianople, scattered the Roman forces, and killed the emperor. This battle is considered one of the most decisive in history because it left the Roman Empire defenseless. It was the first major battle that Rome had lost in hundreds of years. German tribes outside the empire began to round up their cattle, mobilize their fighting men, and move toward the Roman borders. 32 years after the Battle of Adrianople in 410, the Visigothic general Alaric led the Visigoths to Rome itself, which they sacked and looted. By that time, other German tribes, the Franks, Vandals, and Burgundians, were also moving into the empire. About 450 AD, the German tribes from the northwest Europe, these are the Angles, Saxons, and Utes, they sailed to Britain, where they killed or enslaved some of the Britons and forced others to retreat into Wales and Scotland. The Romans, who had previously occupied Britain, had withdrawn their troops earlier to protect the empire near Italy. The Anglo-Saxon invaders destroyed Roman civilization in Britain and set up rival kingdoms. For the next 600 years, Anglo-Saxon England had a weak central government. However, the people did develop a strong tradition of participation in local government, which was the seed for later democratic government in the area, that is, a government run by common people. To add to the violence and confusion, the Huns, led by Attila, also invaded the empire, threatening to enslave or destroy both Romans and Germans. So, forgetting their own differences for a while, the Romans and Germans united against their common enemy, the Huns. Romans and Germans stood together against the Huns in Gaul and defeated Attila at the Battle of Chalons in 451 AD. Meanwhile, the emperors in Rome had become so weak that they were mere puppets of the army. Many Roman soldiers were of German birth, and one, Odoacer, became a commander of the Roman armies. In 476, he deposed the last puppet Roman emperor, a German boy named Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer was the first German ruler of Rome, not officially approved by the Senate. Thus, the date 476 is often given as the date for the fall of Rome. In a strict sense, however, there was no fall. The decline of Roman imperial power had been slow and complicated. Weak emperors, corrupt officials, and admission of German soldiers into the legions had all played a part. Since the early decades of the 4th century, several emperors at Rome had sensed the growing weakness of the Western Empire. As you learned earlier, in 330, Emperor Constantine moved the capital to the city of Byzantium, when he then renamed Constantinople, in the eastern part of the empire. By the end of the century, the Roman Empire had become permanently divided. One emperor ruled in the west, another in the east. Still, the two sections of the empire, although separated, continued to be thought of as one. In fact, the western part of the empire was breaking up. By the year 476, when Odoacer became the Roman ruler, German kingdoms had been established in many former Roman provinces. The Anglo-Saxons were in England. The Visigoths ruled Spain. In North Africa, the Vandals had established a kingdom, and by 486, the Franks controlled Gaul. Italy was the scene of much warfare, and in 493 it fell to the Ostrogoths. Then it was ravaged by civil war and further invasions. Italy, which had been the center of the mighty Roman Empire, would not be united again under one government until the 19th century. The eastern part of the empire, however, did not collapse or give way to internal decay and invasions. With its capital at Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire endured, ruled by emperors, for another 1,000 years. During all that time, it preserved much Greco-Roman culture and served as a buffer for Western Europe against the invasions from the Middle East. As the Roman Empire declined, a new civilization developed in its place. This civilization combined elements of the old Roman culture with the vigor and energy of the conquering Germanic tribes. The Christian church became the main force in shaping this new civilization. During the Germanic invasions, the Roman government gradually stopped providing the services needed to carry on daily urban life. City populations shrank as commerce declined, and people turned to farming for survival. Living as farmers in rural areas, people found security by working for powerful local landlords. However, as the farmers fell behind in rent payments, Roman law bound them to the land to work off their debt. Such changes were slow and occurred over hundreds of years. Most people were unaware that more and more people were becoming the property of or serfs of their lords. In many regions, the Germans moved in and outnumbered the old inhabitants. The newcomers soon took on Roman customs and continued the blending of peoples that had been going on before the invasions. Germans adopted many of the old Roman practices and kept Latin as the official language. They also converted to Christianity and supported the church. In Rome, as the emperors became weaker, the Pope and their assistants took on some of the powers of the government. Church officials set up church courts and claimed the right to collect tax. The governmental power of the church was especially evident from 590 to 604, when Gregory the Great was pope. He supervised the police, directed the generals of the army, coined money, and kept the all-important aqueducts or water carriers in repair. So the church replaced the government. As early as the 3rd century, fearless missionaries had carried the teachings of Christianity beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire. One of the most important of these missionaries was Ulfilas, an Arian Christian. Ulfilas preached among the Gothic peoples and converted them to Christianity. Ulfilas invented a Gothic alphabet, which he used to translate the Bible into the Germanic language. Another famous missionary, Saint Patrick, was born in Britain about 389 AD. He journeyed to Ireland to convert the Celtic peoples to the faith and founded many monasteries that became famous as centers of learning. In 596 AD, Pope Gregory sent a Roman monk, Augustine, as missionary to England. Augustine converted Ethelbert, King of Kent, to Christianity, and later became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. During the years of the Roman persecutions, a few Christians went into the wilderness, giving up worldly interests and living alone. Others lived in groups, dedicating themselves to the service of God. Christian monasteries and convents were places where groups of monks or nuns lived apart from the world. They were first set up in Egypt in the 4th century and soon spread to other parts of the Roman Empire. When men and women went out to live a holy life alone, they were often very hard on themselves. The earliest of these people withdrew from the world to live alone in deserts or in the wilderness. Some hermits, as they were called, tormented themselves by prolonged fasting, starving themselves, rolling in thorns, or living in snake-infested swamps. One hermit, St. Simeon Stelitz, built a pillar 60 feet high and spent the last 30 years of his life on top of it. These hermits were driven by extreme spiritual feeling. They believed that by suffering or depriving themselves, they could purify their souls. Such practices were not typical of most Christians of the time. The less extreme monks and nuns concluded that the solitary life of the hermit was not the proper way to practice Christianity. Instead, these Christians chose to live together in communities. They did not engage in prolonged fasting, but did farming and other productive work and spent many hours of the day and night in meditation, silent spiritual thinking. Monasteries and convents gave these people a way to live apart from society and dedicate their lives to God, yet live productively. About the year 520, Saint Benedict set up a monastery at Cassino in Italy and drew up rules for the monks to live by. Saint Benedict's rules required obedience and poverty, daily prayer, and at least 6 hours of useful work each day. The rules of the Benedictine order were widely adopted by other monasteries and are still followed today. In German lands beyond the old frontiers, where life remained crude and isolated, monks not only spread the teachings of Christianity, but also advanced civilization. In wild and forested regions, monks often cleared forests, drained swamps, and introduced new crops. The few schools that existed in Europe during the early Middle Ages were set up by and run by the monks. Some monasteries also served as hospitals and as inns for travelers. At a time when libraries were neglected and precious manuscripts were destroyed or lost in looting, monks wrote out the scriptures and other works and preserved them in monasteries. Nearly every important monastery had a writing room where monks copied manuscripts by hand. They're called scriptoriums. These manuscripts were lavishly illustrated or illuminated with brilliantly colored designs and intricate letters. Inks were made of gold and rare minerals. The monks also kept historical records called chronicles. One of these chronicles, the Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation, written by St. Bede in the early 700s, is the best account available of 200 years of early English history. So thank you, Church, for preserving history and the government and social, performing social functions. So, how was the church able to outlive the empire? How are missionaries important? And how did the empire collapse? What caused the empire to collapse?